Hi, this is Carl Rust, and I've worked in schools for over 30 years. I've learned a lot about how people learn, and I wrote a book called Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn: How We Can Transform Schools and Reintroduce Natural Learning. Hello, everybody. Carl Rust here, longtime educator, author, singer-songwriter, all-around rebellious person. Welcome to the podcast, Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn. This is episode 3. It's great to be here. I'm recording this on July 6th. So we just had the 4th of July holiday, which made me think a minute about things that we say in the United States and maybe in other places around the world. If you remember those famous words of the Declaration of Independence that they use in kind of a paternalistic society, but we can kind of tweak the words a little bit. I'm going to look at the text here. Hopefully my picture won't go away. So the opening, the second sentence of the Declaration says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And we say that, but do we mean it? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we've had marginalized groups for all of our history, and we still do. But I would suggest that one of our most marginalized groups are young people, because we stick them in schools and, for all intents and purposes, lock the door and don't allow them to leave. So we are depriving them of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even in the classroom, the teacher's presenting a lesson. Well, at least we're not killing most of them. But as far as liberty and pursuit of happiness, so if little Carl in the back row is doing something so dastardly as, like I used to do in my 4th grade class, making little paper soldiers and tanks and battleships out of notebook paper and stacking my books up so the teacher couldn't see it and having battles with the kids next to me. I was pursuing happiness. I was exercising my liberty. But fortunately, we had a very nearsighted older lady for a teacher, so most of the time we got away with it. But if we would have been discovered, that would have been bad news for us. That was still back in the day when we got paddled, so we probably would have got paddled and our parents would have got called. Just this terrible thing was happening. Kids were exercising their liberty and their pursuit of happiness. And it still happens today. So today we have such wonderful devices as iPads and cell phones that are in a lot of kids' hands, if not all. But don't pursue happiness with that device. Don't exercise your liberty with that device. You must use it to fulfill the agenda of the adult. So I would suggest that maybe we should rethink this thing. And, if you want to be honest about it, don't pretend like we value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, especially for younger people, older people, people of color, etc., etc., etc. So that's the news. I always try to start off with a little segment of what's happening now. So July 4th just went by, and I hope you had a happy celebration. Today's topic is going to be I think in my book I said children, but I kind of like the phrase younger learners. Should children learn the same thing at the same time? And for that matter, should anybody have to learn the same thing at the same time? Does it make sense in our modern world? So let me see. So this is how I start the chapter off. I always like to start with a little vignette, like a little story from my experience in schools. So this is a little story that I made up. Eloise is daydreaming again. It is math time, and Mr. Marshall is going over adding with regrouping again. So boring. She caught on to the idea the first week it was brought up, and now she is bored out of her skull because half of the class isn't getting it. Mr. Marshall glanced at her sympathetically. At least he doesn't pick on me, she thinks. She doodles on the math worksheet that they all have. Must be a law somewhere that says everybody has to do the same work at the same time, even if they already know how to do it. Eloise looks at her friend Lacey, who is staring at the ceiling. Lacey can't even remember her basic addition facts, so this is just as boring for her. Lacey still counts on her fingers for problems like 6 plus 2, so regrouping isn't making much sense to her at all. And if you worked in a classroom, or if you think back to your days, you will sympathize. Okay. Yeah, also in my book, I quote John Holt, which a lot of people are familiar with his body of books that he wrote. He was a school teacher that ended up being a big homeschool advocate for homeschooling. In The Underachieving School, John Holt writes, the idea of a body of knowledge, in quotations, to be picked up at school and used for the rest of one's life is nonsense in a world as complicated and rapidly changing as ours. So, what do you think? Is there a body of knowledge that everybody needs to know? People have certainly made lists. And this is the big thing now, standards. Every state has standards. There's common core standards. There's standards for this and standards for that. With the idea that somebody thought, okay, when people become adults, or maybe when they graduate from college, or whenever they become a mature person, there are things that they're supposed to know. And I think you could make a case for some of that. But I think they got a little carried away with it. So they started at the top, came up with all these things they thought people should know, and then they tried to kind of go down, from like 12th grade, and then what would 11th graders need, what would 10th graders, 9th, 8th, 7th, all the way down to kindergarten. They spent a lot of time and a lot of work coming up with these standards. So, are there things that everybody needs to know? I think there's probably some. And I'm going to talk about a few of those. But, even before the explosion of technology and information, we live in the information age. Even if you go back hundreds of years, when probably the knowledge of the world probably contained mostly in books and in libraries and to some degree in other mediums, but you probably had to go to a certain spot and buy something or sit in a theater or you had to go to that. And to go to a classroom and sit and listen to a person, an expert, hopefully, talk about a subject, that was a valuable thing to do. In today's day and age, just about any knowledge I want is available through the internet. But, so what kind of things do people need to know? And is there a case to be made for everybody learning it at the same time? So the two things I want to point out here. One is, even if you agree on basic skills and understandings that are valuable to most, if not all, that list of skills and understandings would be markedly different for people living in different areas. People who live in the Bahamas or maybe the African desert don't need to understand ice and snow at the same level as someone living in northern Alaska. So there's the idea of geography might influence. The level of technology in your society might influence what you need to know. So what are some things that are probably important in the 21st century? I think it's important to be able to find things out and communicate effectively with others. I think it's valuable to have a basic understanding of history, maybe not all the dates and all the names, but kind of an idea of where have we come from, where did all things start and how did they develop over time. And I'm kind of a history guy, so maybe some of you think, yeah, I don't need that. Math, it's probably important to handle money, make a budget, and avoid being cheated. That's pretty important. And I know there are other professions where you need a lot more specific knowledge. To be an engineer or a doctor or an airline pilot, there's certain things that you have to know. But we've seen case after case after case of when somebody makes that decision that they want to do that thing. I want to be a physicist. Then they go through the steps that they need. They gain the knowledge that they need to do that thing. And that creates real learning because they have a need to know that. If I try to teach astrophysics to someone, say my plumber, he doesn't need that information, even if he's polite, which he probably wouldn't be. But even if he's polite and listens, he's not going to remember it because he has no use for it. So here's something the American Psychological Association website says. Just because you have a classroom full of students who are about the same age doesn't mean they're equally ready to learn a particular topic, concept, skill, or idea. It is important for teachers and parents to understand that maturation of the brain influences learning readiness. And brains mature at different rates. Just because I'm 10 or 11 or 12 doesn't mean my brain has reached the same maturity, and it's true of physical maturity as well. It drives teachers crazy to try to teach standards to a group because the group is very diverse usually in their brain maturation, their interests, their prior knowledge. It just, as I've said before, it's almost impossible. So they came up with this idea of covering the standards. So teacher can claim to cover the standards if they present it and they give some work and practice in that area. But just because I covered a standard doesn't mean anybody learned it. It just means that I can say, yep, I talked about it. I think they were listening to me. Some of them did work that shows me that they were listening. Some of them, and probably the common phrase to be said would be, some of them didn't understand. But what I would suggest, instead of we don't know, because they're either not willing or not able to demonstrate the understanding that the adults want them to demonstrate. That doesn't mean they don't know things. It just means they're not showing it. One way to look at standards could be, maybe, is kind of like steps on a journey and say, okay, here's a milepost. When you can do this thing, you've reached this, turn in the road. But, life sometimes is a road, but sometimes it's a big field and sometimes it's a big ocean. So the kids may be running off over the hill and we're trying to get them to go down a mile. We're trying to get them to the milepost. I think it's a big mistake to treat standards as some kind of a rigid, inflexible measure of what students should know and be able to do. No two people are at any age are the same, and they don't have the same interests or abilities. Again, if you get a group of random adults together and try to give them a lecture on art history, some of them may be interested, a lot of them won't be. That's why when, as adults, we choose what we go to see. I want to find out about art, so I'm going to go to this art history lecture. And my wife may say, I don't want to do that, I'm not interested. And that's perfectly okay for adults, but for kids it's not okay. Here's an example of a state standard from Indiana, grade 4. Compare and contrast the point of view from which different stories are narrated, including the difference between first and third person narratives. That's a state standard for fourth grade. So fourth graders are 9 or 10 years old usually. Some of them may be capable of understanding point of view, but I know a lot of adults, older people, that don't really understand it. Even people with college degrees get confused about point of view. So in a traditional school or in a conventional school, most likely students would be introduced to some rules such as if the author uses the pronoun I in the narration, the text is probably written in first person. And if the author uses the pronoun he, she, or they, the narration is probably written in third person. Now, you probably assign students to read some text and decide, is this first person, third person? And you literature people know it gets way more complicated than that. This is just like the basic. This is like the entry level. So you give them a work to do. Hopefully you give some clear examples so people don't get mixed up. But you should read some worksheets, and I'm going to pull some out one of these times and read you some things that adults present to kids as homework. And they're so confusing. And so they give maybe give some clear examples in the lesson. But then when they give the work is very confusing. But what happens when in the middle of a third-person narrative, dialogue pops up in quotation marks or interior thoughts, perhaps in italics, using the first-person pronoun? Then what? Is that first person or third person? Wouldn't that be a stumbling block to students who really want to do well and may over-apply the first-person rule? If they mark the passage as third person, they will get reinforcement from the teacher. Their confusion invisible. If they mark it as first person, it will be marked incorrect. And so this is an example. And the other thing about this, is this important in daily adult life to understand the different points of view? If you're not going to be a writer, I mean, I guess it's handy to get some understanding of things that you're reading or maybe watching, but it's not critical, I don't think. I think you can understand what you're reading even if you don't know it's third person or first person, and not to mention the confusion of second person, and there's lots of others. Wouldn't it be better to let the children enjoy reading and have some discussions? Is it really important for their future lives that fourth graders understand point of view? Isn't it better to just enjoy good books, newspapers, websites, etc.? In Sherlock Holmes is Wrong on the Sudbury Valley School website, Scott David Gray writes, the website for the Common Core State Standards Initiative takes hundreds of pages simply to present a summary of the ideas and facts that children at various grade levels are expected to agree with, memorize, and recite back. Various states and local agencies, as well as private organizations that advise teachers, add more items to be filed away in students' mind during their schooling. And if you look at state standards, and they're out there, you can probably Google them for whatever state you live in or wherever you are in the world. Look at them. There are pages and pages and pages of this stuff. And some of it, part of the problem with standards also is when they take a concept that they think a 12th grader should know and then they try to back it down, they start getting some standards that are so overly specific as to almost become meaningless. So why do we have them? Why do we have this idea that kids need to learn the same thing at the same time? Well, it's really for adult convenience, because if I try, it's possible to individualize instruction, but it's more work on the adult part if I'm still going to try to direct everybody's path. Of course, some of us would say the answer is just to maybe present some standards to the group, but let the kids follow their own interests. If you are bound and determined that you are going to be the adult in charge, you're going to be the sage on the stage, then the idea of coming up with a program for 25 different people, it just seems impossible. And it's also fear. Adults are afraid that children will miss some key information that may come back later to haunt them. Also, we have these international competitions. The U.S. is ranked 10th in math or whatever it is. We want to be better than the Northern Europeans and the, whoever it is. They think that it's easier to consult a thick book of standards to guide the planning of today's lesson than to trust in the natural process of children educating themselves. So there's some examples in here of schools that don't do it that way. So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this, the Rumte Democratic School in the Netherlands says we do not work with a preconceived curriculum. As a result, students take on their personal responsibility and have the wheel in their own hands. Together with staff members and teachers, they also fulfill all tasks and roles in the school that are normally only in the hands of adults. So, in other words, you can listen to somebody talk about standards, or you can actually become immersed in life lessons. Another quote from John Holt. The adults say, suppose they don't learn something they will need later. The time to learn something is when you need it. No one can know what we will need to learn in the future. Much of the knowledge we need 20 years from now may not even exist today. So it's more about developing the capacity to find things out, communicate. And one of the things that we found in our alternative program was the kids were growing in language and they were growing in math, even though we had no formal instruction. And we had very little informal instruction. And it puzzled me because I kept thinking we were taking the NWEA test 3 times a year, and our kids were growing, and they were actually exceeding the average growth for their age groups. And I kept thinking, why? Why is this happening? Well, instead of worrying about curriculum and standards, we were building a community. And in a community, people talk to each other, they express their opinion, they make a plan, they compromise, they cooperate, they collaborate. And when there's conflict, you take the time to try to sort it out with words. So language is very, very important when you are building a community. Math was a little more obscure to me, but I also thought we're doing a lot of physical activities, a lot of riding bikes, skateboarding, skating, running around, playing tag. Also a lot of Minecraft and a lot of YouTube. And I thought maybe it's just, in some ways, they're exercising their mathematical brain function. They're exercising their math brain muscle. And they're exercising their language brain muscle. They're doing things instead of listening to me talk about things. So they need to figure out how to make this ramp so they can ride the bike up and fly off into another ramp or whatever they're trying to do. Or they're trying to figure out what speed do I need to propel my skateboard to get to the top of this. And it's not a math lesson like arithmetic, like 2 plus 2, but it's mathematical thinking, which is really, I think, ultimately what we want. We want kids to be able to think mathematically, scientifically, being able to express themselves, being able to listen and learn and then express. And I think that's what people at school would say they're trying to do, but it's kind of like teaching somebody about democracy by using authoritarian methods. The real way to learn about democracy is to practice democracy. So the way to learn about reading is to read. The way to learn about speaking is to speak. The other thing, and I'm not sure if this is off the topic or not, but one thing about standards is it tends to promote the idea that we can divide knowledge up into little boxes. And this is language over here, and this is reading, and this is math, and this is science, and this is social studies. And really, there is no such thing in real life. There's no box that you put your knowledge into. So, the other thing we also do at school is we elevate certain kinds of, I guess, media, you would say. So, books are like the top of the heap. And maybe educational videos are down there somewhere. But in the modern world, I don't know about you, but if I have a need to know something, one of the first places I'm going is YouTube. I'm still a little old-fashioned, so I may go to the library and get a book. But YouTube, sometimes I'm recording music or I'm doing something, and something with my program, I'll just get kind of run into a little roadblock, and there's some little thing I want to do, and I can't figure out how to do it. I look at the manual, and that doesn't help me. But if I put that question into Google, there's usually about at least 5 videos, maybe 500, that tells me exactly, and they're like 2 minutes long, so I can even fast forward a little bit and get to the part that's really going to answer my question. So if we allow kids to kind of ask their own questions and seek their own answers, that's a life skill. So that later on in life, when they reach a little roadblock or they don't know how to do something, they can just easily, type it in and find it. The other thing that is important, I don't know, practicing writing is probably a good thing, or practicing speaking, writing. But like I was saying, in school we tend to elevate writing and reading books above everything else. We don't, talking and listening, or they're in the standards, but they're hard for us to put into our classrooms because our classrooms are built on being quiet, which is another point that I think is really important, is that we say we want kids to be able to communicate, collaborate, be problem solvers, be creative thinkers and critical thinkers, but we won't let them talk. I think if you go into a school, one of the key things you're going to hear over and over and over is be quiet, get in line, stop talking. Sit down. They usually try to be more polite than this, but it's sit down, shut up, do what you're told. That's not how we're going to build creative thinkers, critical thinkers, problem solvers, communicators, collaborators. If we really think that everybody should learn the same thing at the same time, then we get up there and talk and have people take notes and give homework. The other thing about standards and curriculum is it's a big moneymaker for corporations, because schools, since they have to have, up till just recently, a textbook that had all the 6th grade standards or 5th grade or whatever had to be packed into this textbook. That made textbook companies very, very powerful and very wealthy. Now, it's probably evolving into websites, still a lot of textbooks, but evolving into websites. But again, with the idea of you've got to have this particular website, this particular textbook, because we have all the standards for Indiana or wherever you live. I don't believe that the failure of schools has anything to do with good or bad curriculum. If your school has healthy, happy children and healthy, happy adults, just about any curriculum can be a starting point. The key is letting children make decisions for themselves with the help of caring adults. Wow, what a concept. So, suggestions for what you can do, your local school. And I would say, even if you don't have children in school, you can have an impact on your local school. You can volunteer. You can become a substitute teacher. You can go to school board meetings. You can talk to leaders in schools. Give them a copy of my book. So one thing that you can do with standards is you can look at the vertical articulation of standards. So what they'll do is they'll give you each grade level as a separate thing, but they'll also have a chart somewhere that takes you all the way from the lowest level. Some of them start at kindergarten, some don't start till second or third grade, all the way up to 12th grade or however high they go. And look at the top one and say, what do we want people to be able to do when they become adults? I still would advise you not to make that carved in stone law, but maybe just kind of a target to think, okay, it's probably a good thing for people to be able to read and understand multiple texts. That's not a bad thing. So maybe we'll have that as a goal. And the way we'll do that is we'll have lots of texts available, lots of books, magazines, videos, lots of stuff for people to watch and do and become involved with. Encourage discussion, encourage arguing and all that kind of thing. And then just look at that as a target. You could look at some standards as a way to just design a presentation. There, like I said before, in my mind, there's nothing wrong with presenting information to people. I think where we get off track is when we try to make them do stuff. We can say, hey, I'm going to present, and I did this in my experiment I did with my long-term sub in the 6th grade. The kids love to do, especially this one group, they love to do presentations. So I would give them a presentation, and I also decided my presentation shouldn't have any more prestige than theirs, so I made mine last. They would fill up the whole hour with their presentation, so there wouldn't be any time for mine, and that was fine. But I would present them with information, and then they could do with it what they wanted to. It was just so I could look at my standards and say, I think this one's a pretty good one. I'm going to show a video, or I'm going to give a little talk, or whatever I'm going to do. The third suggestion in my book is to consider letting learners develop their own curriculum. And if you really think that they need to do standards because you really believe in them, another thing that you could do, I don't think this is ideal, but you could just say, hey kids, here's the standard, like my example for point of view. How are you going to do that? And see what they come up with. Okay, well, thanks a lot for listening. Next time I'm going to talk about play. Is play an extra? Is it less important than instruction? Because in many places, not only is it looked on as being less than, it actually gets taken away, which is, I think, the silliest thing ever. If you don't finish your spelling, you're not going to get any recess today, you say to the little squirrely kid. And the little squirrely kid is like, because they love recess. So that's next time. Remember to follow, subscribe, like, and share, and heart. And check out unschoolingschool.com. Check out Carrie McDonald's podcast. I've been listening to that. It's excellent. And just keep thinking about education and learning, and keep learning yourself. So until next time, thanks for listening. This is Carl Rust. Check out my book, Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn, How We Can Transform Schools and Reintroduce Natural Learning. Available anywhere you get your books. And see you next time. This has been Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn podcast. If you liked it, please subscribe, follow, share, and leave a comment.